Welcome. In the name of the ETH Wohnforum and the Parity and Diversity Group of the Department of Architecture, I welcome you all to this year's Athena Lecture. My name is Karina Sacher and I'm a doctoral researcher at the ETH Wohnforum. In collaboration with the Parity Group, the ETH Wohnforum organizes the Athena Lecture Series every year since 2020. Internationally recognized female designers, thinkers, scientists from the fields of urban research, planning, landscape, architecture and housing studies are invited to stimulate critical thinking, initiate discussions and foster ideas by sharing their work and approaches. Today's Athena Lecture by Anna Pagani concludes the 9th edition of the Parity Talks, which took place over the last 2 years. On Convenience, Learning to Listen offered a dense program of workshops, walks and discussions aimed at naming the issues that lead to disparity and by finding ways to talk. The conversation and the Q&A session following Anna's talk will therefore be joined and moderated by members of the Parity Group, Orkun Kassab and Lily Blanchard. And before introducing Anna Pagani, I would like to thank the ETH Wohnforum team for organizing this, Nathalie Reit, Julius Schwarz, and Nicola Morgan, and the Parity Group, also for the apéro that will follow the talk. We are facing an accumulation of multiple interdependent crises on a planetary scale that highlight social inequalities. Housing, a need for everyone and a commodity for the few, is one of the most critical and recurring blueprints of social injustice, as Friedrich Engels pointed out 150 years ago. In our society, COVID-19 has brought to light, in a broader sense, the complex interrelations of the system in which we live, and especially the distribution of housing and quality of life. The major social question of today is largely linked to the climate change and its effects. In order to address these complex societal challenges, we need to quote Anna, to think beyond and across boundaries of our academic and professional fields. How can we transform our way of understanding and intervening in the housing system? This is the guiding question of Anna's work and presentation. Anna is an Italian architect and a postdoctoral researcher holding a double master's degree from Politecnico di Milano and Torino in architecture and building engineering, and a PhD from École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. She has worked as a doctoral and postdoctoral researcher in the Laboratory on Human-Environment Relations in Urban Systems and as a member of the executive board of the research field Healthy Habitats at the Habitat Research Center, both at EPFL. Since November 2020, she has joined the Institute for Environmental Design and Engineering at UCL, University College of London, to work for a 2-year research project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, entitled A Just Transition Towards Housing Sustainability, where architecture and systems science meet. Her work aims at disentangling the complex interrelations that hinder the achievement of just transitions towards housing sustainability and the provision of healthy homes. To this end, her investigations are based on systemic and transdisciplinary approaches, integrating qualitative and quantitative data and simulation tools. In today's lecture, Anna will offer an overview how systems thinking can help to bring to light the plurality of mental models guiding our designs of fixes that reinforce rather than address structural issues such as exclusion of racialized and minoritized communities. Thank you, Anna, for being here.
in which we can digest all the introduction. Okay, here we are. Thank you so much for this introduction, Karina, and thank you so much for inviting me here. I can't express enough what an honor it is to be here to talk about such an important issue that is not only part of my research and teaching, but very, very close to my heart, which is housing justice. And in particular today, we're going to talk about the many ways in which we try to solve the issues around housing justice, and with many fixes that eventually have failed, and why and how we can act upon this. So I'm going to take you on a 45 minutes journey, more or less, that starts with systemic inequalities. So I would like to start with this quote from Murray Bookchin, the author of Post-Scarcity Anarchism. It's 1986, and he says, "A struggle against elitism and hierarchy as such is replacing the struggle for rights as the main goal. It is not justice any longer that is being demanded, but rather freedom." So it really points at the difference between having rights, which are given to us, and having justice that is given to us, versus having freedom. There is a subtle but quite deep difference in this. But achieving freedom in the world today seems still to be a hard-to-reach goal. We are currently facing what is called the polycrisis, meaning the accumulation of different interrelated crises, as this image from the World Economic Forum shows. The interplay between COVID-19, the wars that, beyond shaking our mind and hearts, are impacting the cost of living, of course, migrations, which are even made worse by the current climate crisis. And all of these do not just happen here in Zurich with the rising cost of housing, with the climate crisis that we can see every day if we hike up in the mountains, but affect everyone globally. So these are global crises. We're all experiencing that right now. However, these crises do not affect everyone equally. This is, for instance, a picture from a research, a figure that shows the projected geographical shift of the human temperature niche, showing that, of course, in around 50 years, even less actually, not all places in the world are going to exactly be inhabitable. Actually, several of those are going to be uninhabitable. The Institute for Economics and Peace says that around 1.2 billion people could be displaced by climate change over the next 30 years. This is massive. And imagine all the dynamics that this will trigger, all the pressure that this will trigger, and the social reactions to that. But again, those crises have different responsibilities. Not only they're unequally distributed, but also the responsibilities over those crises are not exactly the same, right? So I work and do research and teach in the UK, which has a quite well-known colonialist past. But each country in the so-called global north has had its share of responsibility. This is a quote from the Human Rights Council that actually states that between the 16th and 19th century, Swiss state entities, including Zurich and Bern, so where we are today, directly purchased shares in the companies and individual expeditions involved in the trade and trafficking in enslaved Africans. And the Swiss also imported industrial quantities of cotton, coffee, and famous chocolate, of course, available at rates reflecting extractive, colonial, and slave labor conditions. So somehow we're all in different ways in the global north responsible for this. And interesting enough, the way in which we try to respond to these crises seems still to be very short of sight, seems actually to perpetuate those inequalities. Today, our idea that we're going to solve the climate crisis just by going towards green growth and clean technologies seems to again displace all the problem towards those regions of the world that are the most disadvantaged, such as, for instance, the right now fights around lithium in Argentina, which is at the heart of tensions with indigenous communities. Why so? If we know this, why is this happening? This is because we're not really good at working with systems, if I may say. According to John Sterman, a professor at MIT, systems are history dependent. We say you can't unscramble an egg, meaning that doing and undoing do not take the same amount of time. Sometimes undoing what we have done can take a much, much longer time. Systems are tightly coupled. You just can't do one thing. Actually, you're going to touch one part of the system, and this is going to have massive consequences across the system that sometimes are very difficult to predict. This is also because systems are non-linear. This means that the effect is rarely proportional to the cause. A decision that I might make here is in this region might have a very disproportionate consequences in other regions of the world. Systems are governed by feedback, so somehow they send us a feedback at a certain point to our actions. However, this feedback can be very much delayed in the sense that I might, let's say, decide to implement a policy that short term is going to have a certain positive effect, but what about the long term? And if you think about it, often our political institutions and so on and so forth are organized over 4 or 5 years terms, which is by far not sufficient to understand how well we're performing in terms of cultural impact or environmental impact. Also, for instance, developers, if we talk about the housing sector, are often pushed to take care of projects just a few years of post-occupancy evaluation, not really being able to value what is going to really be the impact on communities over the long term. More generally, systems are counterintuitive. So often we try to solve the symptoms that we see, for instance, like with green growth, but it's a little bit more difficult for us to really understand the consequences and, the root causes and act on those. And unfortunately, since systems are what we call policy resistant, often the way in which we address those causes actually worsen the current situation through what in systems thinking we will call a system archetype, fixes that fail. So it often happens that we have a problem. We're going to go there with our own mental models on how to fix it. We're going to try, for instance, to build more housing because we have scarcity of social housing and a lot of problems in social housing, or we might decide to demolish a building because the quality of that building doesn't seem to be high enough. And all of this is going to have a number of unintended consequences that I propose you to explore together today. So as you heard me already saying quite a lot in this beginning of presentation, my interest in these fixes that fail is specifically in housing. Housing is a field where it's normal. It's an important, this means the hour is over, right? So housing is an important field where to study inequalities and inequities. This is again an example from a research, and one of the many examples is indeed where we can see those inequalities and inequities is COVID-19. In this figure, we can see how, according to researchers, structural racism determines, or let's say determines the likelihood of people of color living in more structurally vulnerable neighborhoods. What does this mean is that basically before COVID-19, those neighborhoods were more exposed to pollution, limited walkability, lower quality housing stock, less accessible healthcare, that during COVID-19 manifested itself in limited ability to take social distance, in crowded housing, limited protective social environments, and eventually a greater exposure and morbidity and mortality for COVID-19. So in England, where I live, around 40% of Black African, Black Caribbean, and mixed white and Black African live in social housing. Social housing is the kind of tenure that is supposed to offer you housing at 50% of market rate, that is supposed to offer you stability of tenure, and that is provided by the councils. So basically it's a public service, or by housing associations. However, due to neoliberal policies, a massive disinvestment in social housing used to represent a third of the housing stock and eventually went down to 17%. It was massively sold to the people who used to occupy those homes and then went into the hands of the private rental sector. And due to this massive disinvestment, not only we have a phenomenon of residualization, meaning that only the most disadvantaged people can have access to social housing, but at the same time, the conditions of social homes are really dramatic. This is actually just one example, unfortunately, of the death of a 2-year-old child caused by mold in a flat. Can today a child die because of mold in a flat? When we try to act in these systems, we expose ourselves to a lot of, indeed, as mentioned before, fixes that fail or unintended consequences. This is a causal loop diagram. So this is a map that shows causal interrelationships between different variables that we built together with architects, urban planners, people expert in building technology, socioeconomic aspects of housing, trying to look at the interrelationship between housing, the street, and health. And we can see that actually that exposure that we have to noise, air pollution, or heat indoors, or mold, as mentioned before, actually, if we try to address it, for instance, via different housing layouts, via different in green, or by this different building technology that we have in yellow, such as better insulation, better mechanical ventilation system, can actually push up housing prices, which is going to lead to the displacement of low socioeconomic status communities, eventually impacting their health, unemployment, and affordability of living in a better home. So it seems that whenever we try to touch this system also as architects, we're going to actually perpetuate dynamics that are already there, actually even more polarizing differences between people who can actually afford good quality housing and the ones who can't. Another way in which residents try to mitigate those increasing costs of housing, which is at the same time one of the key causes of damp and mold, is, for instance, overcrowding. Here we can see that actually, again, in England, social housing and private rental housing have the highest rates of overcrowding. And again, we could think, okay, there is so much overcrowding, we should build more. We should build bigger homes. Interesting enough to see the other picture. This shows the under-occupied homes. And you can clearly see the line up there, which are owner-occupiers. Around 50% of owner-occupiers under-occupy their homes, so have way too much space. So perhaps we can shift the question from actually, should we build more, to what about redistributing housing size? In my PhD, I was doing research on this as well. I was trying to study in Switzerland how we could reduce housing size, which on average at the time, I don't know today, used to be 46 square meters per person, to try to also reduce the environmental footprint of housing. However, also here, when we try to implement these measures, we must think about all the obstacles that this would entail. For instance, what about the non-monetary cost of moving to smaller apartments, even if I'm under-occupying? For instance, if I'm an older person, and due to the old age, it gets more difficult to move, and there is the emotional attachment to the dwelling, and there is also the difficulty of finding a new dwelling, and all the cost that this would imply. So sustainability can also be a discriminatory practice in housing. So it becomes quite clear that when trying to address inequalities and inequities, in particular related to marginalized communities that include social housing tenants and include minoritized and racialized tenants, it is not sufficient to just try to remove the upper part of the monument. We really need to try to look at the roots of that. And this is another example, again, from the Human Rights Council that clearly state we cannot simply think that by building more housing, we're going to remove all the barriers that are faced by people of African descent in Switzerland, for instance. So how can we do? How can we engage with this complexity? How can we provide homes that are resilient to this future that we're looking at and that help us stay below the ecological ceiling, so within our planetary boundaries, and above the social foundation, so that offer us good quality homes, health, food, access to food, and so on and so forth? How can we stay in this safe space for humanity? Well, doing this requires quite deeply challenging the way in which we think. I here quote Donella Meadows, a fantastic systems thinker, author of The Limits to Growth, a book written in 1972. She used to say, remember always that everything you know and everything everyone knows is only a model. Get your model out there where it can be shot at. Invite others to challenge your assumptions and add their own. And as architects, urban planners, we tend to do that quite often, right? We tend to put our designs out there and hopefully not too violently, but having them shot at by the people who supervise us, by the clients, and so on and so forth. But are we really aware of the future that we are designing for? And especially, are we aware of who will be the final recipient of that future when we make a design? Do we say, okay, this is my mental model, this is the way in which I want the future to look like, and actually this is going to be for these people? So, I want to gather a little bit your architectural perspective in here. When we look at this design, this just purely from an architectural point of view, or urban planning, or depending on your feedback or on your background, when you look at these different buildings, do you think that actually these probably are healthy homes? Who thinks that these are probably healthy homes? Just by looking at that, I'm not giving you any clue. Yes? It seems like some are not really sure, but okay, yes. Well, is there an element or something that will make you think that? There's no right or wrong. Something I see here or there? An idea? You're architects, I'm sure that there is something that sparkles.
What is healthy homes?
Oh, well, I knew here we enter in the... Well, I'm asking actually you to say why it is healthy. Then my definition of healthy homes, I promise you I will give you one. Yes? They look rather new, yeah? Big windows, a lot of light, exactly, yeah. Also, I mean, when we look at such a project, indeed, that we would think, as architects and designers, well, this looks like providing quite healthy homes, potentially even sustainable homes. Well, this is Woodbury Down. It's in London. It's built actually in northern London. This is the process of building Woodbury Down, and actually, it's a project that has been going on for decades now, and that resulted in the massive displacement of leaseholders who used to live in those homes, and actually of local shops, and so on and so forth. This is another example, the Aylesbury estate. Actually, when we look at this master plan, we think, well, great, it looks quite green, it looks like we're doing quite an interesting design, right? But And eventually, actually, the goal here was to create mixed communities, so try to mix people of different socioeconomic backgrounds. Again, this encountered a very strong resistance of residents that had been living there for 30 years or more, and that have strongly opposed the demolition of those homes in favor of speculative mechanisms of densification and loss of social housing. So again, we have these systems, like we have a social housing shortage that actually leads to a longer waiting list, more overcrowding, and at the same time we have a poor quality of the housing stock that is affecting tenants' health and well-being. We're architects, we're designers, and instinctively, what would we think? Okay, we think we have a shortage, we need to build. We're going to be healthy, we're going to build better, we're going to build new. But this is part of a complex system. It's part of a very complex system where actually construction, so building, actually shifts, for instance, funding and resources away that typically are devoted to maintenance and repair, reducing maintenance and repair, increasing complaint for this repair, the staff fatigue and distress, eventually having less insight to make good decisions, and eventually have a poorer quality of the housing stock, reinforcing the need to build. And this is only one of the different reinforcing mechanisms that are in there. Similarly, due to this poor health and well-being of tenants, there tends to be quite a stigma associated to the people who live in social housing, and thus to the kind of homes where they live in. And this tends to be responded to via demolition of those homes. It gets easier to demolish them if there is a kind of a stigma associated to those homes. But again, this leads to displacement, dispossession, and eventually decreases the health and well-being of tenants. And when we see this reinforcing loop, or the way we call it, because it's a dynamic that seems to reinforce itself, what do? How do we intervene? Here, housing associations will tell you, well, we try, for instance, to provide different forms of housing so that people not only live in social housing, but also have different options to move to. Or, you know, we're going to try to mix neighborhoods, so bring a little bit of higher income residents together with lower income residents. Again, generating all these R's that you see around, which are reinforcing mechanisms. So, when we try to act on the system, we tend to act on those events that we see. Those events can be overcrowding, can be disrepair, can be death, can be cases of maladministration. We need to react on those events. But under the water, there are patterns and trends that have been there over time, like gentrification, racial discrimination, disinvestment. And those patterns are created by structures, by the system that in my research I try to investigate. So those systems form structures that lead to patterns and to those events. And at the bottom of the structures, actually we are designing those systems. There are mental models of the way in which we think that the world works. For instance, what is the role of the government versus what is the role of the market in providing social housing? What are sustainable communities? Are they mixed communities? Are they single tenure communities? Is homeownership really desirable? So, in order to try to understand this, I would like to, except for my students who already know this game, I would like you to look at the person next to you and try to play this War Tom game. So for the ones who don't know it or who have never played it, you just need to take the hand of the person who is next to you and try to squeeze the Tom. And actually, the goal is to make the largest amount of points possible. So you're just going to look at the person next to you, you're going to take their hand, and you're going to try to squeeze their thumb. Again, the goal is to make the largest amount of points. You have 1 minute. Good. Thanks. I also see that this brings good vibes in the room, you know. No, I promise I didn't do it only to bring good vibes to the room, but it definitely feels a little bit more active than just listening to myself talking. So, how many points did you make? I just want to hear some. 3? Who did more than 3? 1? 4? Who did more than 4, or 4 is the max? 4 is the max? 4. So, what if I tell you that if I play this, I can get easily 50 points? Or 100? I'm not a master of this game. It's just that I told you that the goal is to make the largest amount of points. I didn't tell you how to. I didn't tell you that you had to fight against each other. You could have done it cooperatively. So you could have decided to squeeze the thumb of the other person for the largest amount of times so that you could get together the largest amount of points. And this shows how strong and invisible our mental models at the bottom of the iceberg are. So now that we've been a bit shaken by this, thanks a lot for playing the game. So we need to try to produce this knowledge around these mental models collectively. We need to try to understand how does the system works. We need to try to understand the different mental models of different stakeholders in trying to understand where do they want to go towards, what is their objective, in this case for sustainability. And we need to, I'm sorry, I'm losing my mic, but I speak so loud that I guess that you hear me nonetheless. And we need to try to understand what kind of knowledge we need to go from the current system to the desired one. And in order to do that, of course, we need to learn to listen, which is the topic of these talks this year. So this quote actually from Buddhist warrior training says, "Put down the lead and burden of saving the world alone." So in my research at UCL, I investigate the extent to which the regeneration of social housing, that we've talked a little bit about, can hinder or promote the provision of healthy and sustainable homes. So whether regeneration actually supports building healthy homes or actually is an obstacle to that. So I need to work with a variety of stakeholders, as you might imagine, like architects, urban planners, housing associations, local councils, residents, activists, and their way of understanding the way in which the system works, which is very different. Their goals for sustainability and health. Sustainability is such a broad word, interpreted in a variety of ways, and health, as you raised correctly before, what does health mean? And it means very differently for a lot of people. And I need to try to reconcile them and possibly co-design ways and strategies that address many of the fixes that have been implemented so far. This work is called participatory system dynamics. So mapping those systems in a participatory way. And I'm going to give you an example. So when we started, let's say, this work, we had to look at the vastness of the issues that are there in the social housing sector. It's massive. So we started from key readings, key reports that were actually showing the key issues that were in London in particular around the provision of social housing. We extracted some key variables and their interlinkages. So basically when you take a report or when you look at this map, they should say more or less the same thing. Hopefully they say the same thing. So we produced those maps based on those reports on the issues around social housing and on the gentrification of social housing. So these were two key readings that we were using. The arrows that you see, basically when there is a plus, it means that the two variables that we're looking at go in the same direction, so they both increase or they both decrease. When there is a minus, it means they go in the opposite direction. So in this case, for instance, maintenance and repair is increasing the quality of the housing stock. But if maintenance and repair decreases, also the quality of the housing stock decreases. I promise you that if you're interested, we'll another time do a lecture on system dynamics. And this can generate, let's say, these links of variables can generate what we call balancing or reinforcing loops. This was a small parenthesis. So we developed 6 maps. What was the issue is that it was our interpretation of what was written in those texts that we were trying to extract. And the second issue is that, of course, it was limited to what those texts were saying. So We organized workshops together with the housing associations in this case because it concerned them directly. And these maps, and also with the authors of the Better Social Housing Review, which was one of these texts, and the gentrification of social housing. And these maps were completely reworked, as you can see. Links were confirmed, disconfirmed, amended, the boundaries of the system were changed, variables were added. So eventually, they were reflecting the different perception of reality of those stakeholders. Finally, achieving this kind of map, which might look like a wow when you look at it, but I promise you that if you travel through that, it reveals quite some interesting dynamics. So I have 6 of those. In red are the amendments by the housing associations, in blue by the key authors. And this is just one example where you can, for instance, see one of the many fixes that fail. In this particular case, segregation and poverty concentration is perceived as an issue. I want to say it is perceived as an issue. I'm not saying that it's an issue and what is right or wrong. I'm saying what the actors perceive. And in particular, a lot of responsibility for poverty, for issues, is given to the individual and to the neighborhood in things like antisocial behavior, what we call the neighborhood effect. So if you live with people who are also poor, then you have less chances of climbing the ladder, and this kind of narrative. So the way in which typically people go about it to try to fix this issue is by creating social mixing as a balancing effect up there. However, we have seen in many examples that this can lead to the expulsion, the emotional and physical displacement of people, that can actually eventually create this mixing by creating higher income residents in lower income neighborhood more and increasing together with prices, together with social housing shortage, leading to more stigma and discrimination, more tensions, and so on and so forth. And actually housing associations are aware of that. Like they say, I see tensions all the time. And they just don't know, is this working really? They're not even sure themselves whether actually this is really the right way to go or not. But this map is not only interesting because it's showing the typical gentrification pattern. It actually also shows something that we see up there. So this idea that actually by going through a high quality of the master plan, by having more reflective practitioners, by having community involved in the project, a form of hope that this will be a different way of doing things, again, without judgment, just by observing the mental models. And this is a quote from a housing association saying, I think it's worth noting that, there was okay, our sense of what's progressive changes so much. So the advantages of having those maps is that we can see the mental models in the present. I've mentioned before that actually systems, we can see the effects with a certain delay. So there is a lot of tensions in the social housing sector. Residents blame housing associations, that blame developers, that blame shareholders, and often what we see happening today, the demolition of a building, is actually the result of dynamics and decisions that have been made in the past with different kinds of mental models, and those mental models are evolving. So understanding those mental models help us reconcile different views. I did about 40 interviews individually with different stakeholders that have different system boundaries, different understanding of health, different understanding of sustainability, and you will find the ones who enter into the system because they want to change it, they feel, okay, I'm a developer, but I'm in this system because I want to change how things are. You will find the ones who actually simply aren't aware of the dynamics that they're looking at. All of these are multiple voices that constitute multiple truths. For instance, this is the council, so it's a civil servant saying, well, residents are going to have inconvenience at time and disruption, but hopefully at the end of it, they're going to be happier with their new home. So there's going to be vehicle, there is going to be all sorts of issues, but the residents are going to be happier at the end of it. This resident that says people are being manipulated and they're being told that we must build housing. We have a housing crisis. This is why older women, in particular in my experience, who've been decades in their home, they feel like they are in the way of progress because they're made to feel that they have to get out of the estate, that their home has to be demolished. This is an architect that says sometimes we need to look at the social justice element. If we're saying that retrofit is the only way to meet net zero, we have a problem because we have a need for home. So we see again the need for home rhetoric. If you've got a really long waiting list and your aim is to provide as many homes as possible, and if the demolition is going to give you the homes, well, that's not going to happen. A housing association saying, well, I always tell my architects, design something that's still going to be there in 100 years from now, because now he's basically demolishing most of the stuff that have been there for only 30 to 40 years, but has been literally rubbish for 20 of those years. An academic that says that from a decarbonization perspective, maybe that might be a little bit of a case, but from the life cycle carbon perspective, homes had a lot more life in them. But of course, when you tear down homes and you rebuild, you're able to put more homes on the plot, you're able to make them smaller, you're able to put more people and get more profit. And lastly, a developer that basically says that housing associations have to provide and manage housing, and development is the vehicle that they use, but that vehicle is to make profit. And how can you put together social housing and profit? It's just not going to work. So what I want you to understand is that all of these people believe that the way in which they're acting is for the health and well-being and sustainability of the estates. But the outcome of all of these different mental models is going to be incredibly different. So we're coming to the last part of the talk. Learning to listen is not enough. I've shown you all this different complexity and so on and so forth, but we need to be able to act upon it. Again, Donella Meadows, who tells us that this idea of the leverage points of trying to act in the system is not unique to system analysis. It's actually in legend. The silver bullet, the magic password, the hero, actually that we are able to surmount huge obstacles. We want to believe that there are leverage points. We want to know where they are and how to get our hands on them. So how can we address these wicked problems? How can we make people aware of the system behavior that result from their mental models and challenge them and be radical and be provocative? So Donella Meadows proposed 12 different places where you can intervene in the system. You can act on the physical structure, like let's put taxes on land so that people don't want to speculate. You can work on you can act on the information, so let people make decisions in a way that they're gonna, the people that make the decision be the ones who receive the feedback. So for instance, tenants will be in charge of maintenance and repairs, so eventually they get feedback from the quality of the maintenance and repair. Or the goal of social housing, is it to just provide housing, hopefully healthy housing, or is it to grow? This is two different objectives. And eventually the upper one, to transcend paradigms, to actually accept that there is no real one solution, one right mental models, throwing ourselves in what she calls the humility of not-knowing. We've been playing with these leverage points together with housing associations, so we gave them back the models that we built together with them and responded to their request that was at the end of the first workshop. We look at all of these issues, but how can we act? So we showed them those maps and we developed possible places to intervene in those systems together, thinking about how feasible and how impactful this could be. And eventually, we didn't just try to understand those leverage points, but we also tried to be more provocative. Again, what Donella Meadows writes is that in the word model that was built at the time of the Limits to Grow, that was trying to simulate the whole world dynamics, slowing economic growth seemed to be actually a very, very strong leverage point. Because we tend often to have more faster technological development or freer market prices, but this is just a way to try to catch up with the system that seems to go very fast. But our ideas or technologies do not change that fast. So there is more leverage in slowing the system down than there is in wishing the delays away. And our provocation was, what if there was a moratorium on new house building? What if instead of thinking about continue building, we were stopping building entirely? quite a provocative thought, and the discussions were quite fascinating because stopping building confronted at the beginning the resistance of housing associations and their understanding that we need to build. There is a housing crisis, we need to build, we need to build, we need to build. But then this shifted towards, well, if we were building less, we will focus more on maintenance and repair. This means that we will have better quality homes and less the perception that we need to continue on building. And what it would take and what kind of opportunities it would open up to work under these constraints. To the point that one of the housing association members said that that comment by Donella was quite interesting because before seeing that, I always thought that growth and quick growth would always be good. Learning to listen, finding common ground, giving back. All of this is perceived by housing associations. We learn from them, we learn from our stakeholders, and they learn from us. We challenge them to change or disrupt the way they do things. They felt that there are practical changes that they can make. They could reflect on the received wisdom that drives much decision-making. But this doesn't go only through workshops, activities, and research, but must go through teaching, which is my form of activism. And I see some of my students here. Education is an incredible, incredible vehicle to try to learn how to map systems and how to intervene in those systems. So the possibility to experiment as architects, what are possible places that we can intervene in order to address the current issues that we are observing in our projects and reflecting upon our current mental models. This is an example of the MIS at EPFL, where I teach on urban and territorial design, but I've also been teaching here at ETH in the Master of Advanced Studies on Housing, where actually, in this case, students were looking at racial discrimination in the housing market in Switzerland and trying to think about where they could act within this system. So I hope that in this presentation what you could see or what you could perceive is that we do have agency. We can be activists, like hopefully the many women who talked before me in the past years in this talk. And we also need to try to think that we can rewire our agency, we can be more aware of our mental models, and we can act upon those. This is a quote again from a developer that says, what we're facing in terms of housing is a shared problem. Shareholders, funders, everybody got to serve someone. Everybody gets beaten by the system. And of course, there are terrible people around. There are terrible developers. But they're also a product of the system as much as they're culpable of creating it. So I want to conclude with a few words. In this case, systems thinking, what it can help us to do is to hopefully overcome communication barriers, as we've seen in those different interviews, between actors across the sector that can literally not talk to each other, but are all fighting for the same goal. We can question terminology. What does sustainability mean? How does it manifest itself? What does health mean? And we can address barriers to engagement. Systems thinking also help us to raise understanding and meaningfulness of the system interrelationships. People can understand what systems are, and we can also realize that there are multiple truths. There is not exactly one truth, and there are many trade-offs that we have to constantly make between those different truths. We can challenge this received wisdom and these societal mental models. We can do that. We must do that. Systems thinking can also help to empower stakeholders and to also ask systemic questions. And as architects, we can use projects to design systems goals collectively. And of course, again, systems thinking can help us to support the shift from what is a system of outdated patterns that keep reinforcing themselves towards a more regenerative one. So as Donella Meadows used to say, to listen to the beat of the system and try to dance with it. And hopefully this will help us in our journey to move from rights and justice to freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, very much for this impressive, informative, and eye-opening talk. Before opening the Q&A session, and also because your talk is so much fitting to the Parity Talks of this year, with this impressive method of system thinking, which can, or shows, or you showed actually how it also can be a really effective tool in order to create a dialogue and also to navigate through these different positions despite different feelings, different assumptions we are facing at the moment. And for this, I would welcome also Orkun and Lily to join the discussion. If you want, we can stand or sit, but I think we are standing. And yeah, I will hand over to you.
Unless there's a question from the audience. Give maybe. Sometimes a bit of silence always encourages that question. I think, Lily, I will let you ask the first question.
Okay. But maybe to link it a bit with what we talked at the Parity Talk yesterday, we talk a lot about how to listen, but also who we get to listen to and who is studying architecture, and how also this also influences how architecture is made. And maybe ask you the question, do you think the system can, or we can, do you think our impact on the system also could change if architects were, I don't know, how,
elaborate if you
yeah, maybe you
because we were
elaborate
together. No, it's not better, but I think because we discussed yesterday who gets to be an architect. Mm-hmm. There's different, people from different parts of the society, from different class, yes. From different economic backgrounds, immigration backgrounds, because you also mentioned structural racism, which we also kind of now question in the school, I think. So, and because you also said who designs, and for who. So what do you think about that? Is this education, architectural education, or in general education itself, how does it impact the results in housing?
Yeah. I think I have sometimes it slips away. But yeah, I must say, it's actually a very good question, because I studied in the Politecnico di Torino in Italy. We were 750 students in our first year. We were 250 students per class. Sometimes we had to sit down and just on the floor because there was not enough chairs. And it was a close number. We could have been many more, but there was a selection test at the beginning to get those 750 people. And I remember the professor in my master we were so many that we had 3 minutes to present our project, that we had the whole semester we worked on a project, but he didn't have the chance to look at our project, but just at the very, very end, we had 3 minutes to talk and to eventually be graded on that. And then instead, when I went to EPFL, I suddenly found classes of 15 people, sometimes even 12 people, who had 4 assistants trying to support them in their path. And the way in which we were designing as postdoctoral students, the attention that we were giving to following and structuring actually the course in a way that was the closest possible to everyone's needs was fantastic. And today at UCL I have a similar experience, with the difference that courses and master can cost £33,000. Compared to the Politecnico di Torino that had quite a different rate. So I think who gets to study architecture is very different, of course, in terms of where we study, but especially who gets opportunities to make it eventually to where I'm standing, for instance, now. Because, for instance, in my case, I was able to get scholarships in order to go to Spain, to go to Switzerland, and so on and so forth. And just to give a personal example, which I think is the best way in which we can understand what we call EDI, so equality, diversity, and inclusion, is by trying to give concrete examples. Well, of course, I was studying a lot, and so I could get very good grades in order to get those scholarships. So it's based only on grades. But I had a family that was there, that was helping me, not to study, but to say, cooking, being there, giving me all the support so that I could focus only and only on studying and eventually get good grades and get on. And when I had to come to EPFL for an Erasmus exchange, it was the time in which actually Erasmus had cut the funds. And suddenly I would have found myself without the possibility of going, and some of my colleagues had to give up. But I was lucky enough instead to have a support that for which I could eventually come to EPFL. So I think where we end up is, of course, very much systems, as we said, are history dependent. We cannot unscramble an egg. So actually, it's very difficult to talk about merit today of where you are. Of course, there is a share of what the architects that we see today and how well they're doing that is based on the huge amount of effort that it takes to get somewhere. But the other share is the huge amount of support that you had, which is related, of course, to a lot of factors that unfortunately discriminate quite massively between students. And I want to add one thing, however, on that huge effort to make it somewhere. Professors have also a massive responsibility, and this is one system archetypes that we call success to the successful. How often have you been like a good student, and so you were the one who was asked to give presentations because the others were not as good as you were, and so you were the ones that during projects was speaking, which meant that you trained much more than your colleagues in speaking, which eventually you became a very good speaker and ended up being where you are. So also teaching is a big responsibility in trying to give everyone the opportunity to train those skills, because the success to the successful kind of archetypes is another of those system archetypes that is polarizing our society. I hope that this answers your question. Okay.
And maybe on a more practical note, you talk a lot about talking with housing association or also inhabitant and other actors of the system. Yeah. And how do you address this also somehow hierarchy that exists in between these different actors, and how can you do it in a practical level, maybe?
Yeah, thank you. This is quite, again, a challenging question. Like, I would say that, again, there are different barriers to participation, especially when it comes to the interaction between research and practice. Imagine that those maps that I built, interviews can take 2 hours, sometimes 3, depending on how chatting people are. And if I'm a researcher, I'm happy to do it because it's within my PhD, postdoc, professorship time. But if I'm working, actually, I had at a certain point, I interviewed a resident. It was very, very late at night. And then we had to redo it on a Saturday. And I know that it was their free time that they were devoting to research. So often in that case, you have a kind of a bias of the sample that you receive, because you only get the people who are the most willing to share things with you because they feel the most engaged, they feel most the need to talk to you, and they're happy to sacrifice, because it's really sacrificing 2 or 3 hours of their time to engage. And then I think that systems thinking is quite strong in terms of when I present the different maps, the different systems and way in which systems are perceived, do not depend, in this case, on hierarchies. So, of course, when I do a workshop, I do it with housing associations or I do it with residents, and I try to do it in such a way that you try to address all kinds of barriers. You create an environment that is as safe as possible, emotionally safe, so that people feel that they can share as much as they can. But then when you show these different maps to people, there's no hierarchy in knowledge in there. There is no one system that is more right than the other ones. All these mental models are ways of understanding reality, are all different truths. The difference and the power dynamics is on which truth eventually takes over the others to shape the built environment. Whenever we walk in a city and we see buildings and we see demolition, this is the result of a fight, of a tension, of which there is eventually one winner that won and led to the demolition. But there is not, so hierarchy is of course in terms of power, of who will get the last word in this process of tensions, who will eventually end up deciding for demolition, for refurbishment, and so on and so forth. But systems thinking helps to put all of those truths on the same level.
Are there already questions from the audience?
Hi, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I was wondering, like as you just said, if all of these systems have their own truth and it's not that one is more correct than the other, how would you use them? Or is the idea to kind of manage to combine them into one system that's like above all of them, or that combines all the systems into one? And would the idea be then to actually then use the system to solve problems and to actually find the best solution?
Thank you. You know, this is really an excellent question. And I can tell you that's also because it's exactly what I'm going to do next. So I'm exactly at that point now in my research where I have collected all these different mental models. And the next step is there can be different ways in which we can actually go next. So we can indeed try to think whether, for instance, there are common topics that run across. For instance, health is one of those topics that run across those maps. And for instance, is health the outcome, like we could see in the building, etc.? So people understand that the regeneration is going to be healthy because it's the outcome, or is it the process? And just already bringing those mental models to light and say, well, health is understood in this way or this different way can trigger dialogue. So the idea is, now that I've worked with stakeholders individually, would be ideally to bring them together and to see, once you have them together, what kind of truth emerges from that. And also, again, already being aware of our own mental models and the fact that there are different mental models can be a trigger to act. And I could see it when we did this provocation around the building moratorium. Like this idea of stopping building at the beginning for housing associations was entirely unsettling. So also looking at different mental models could be quite strongly unsettling. But even if, as social scientists, we say we are constructivists, so we don't believe that there is one truth. Let's say, instead, positivist scientists would say, well, there is one truth and we're trying to discover that truth and go in there. For social scientists, already seeing all these different truths and trying to understand, okay, how can we reconcile them towards a shared design that is going to bring us to the next step, would already be a very highly ambitious goal. Hopefully, if we believe in collective intelligence, that's what we need to try to trigger. I know it doesn't fully give you the answer or the bullet, silver bullet, but that's a process.
Thank you. This is Marie Glaser. I'm from the Federal Office of Housing, and I come here. I'm very interested in your method and approach in systems thinking. And my question is now, in your work, you said, okay, the next step is yet to come. But how do you bring it into practice? So do you stop with analyzing and telling all the stakeholders, okay, now these are the results of our fantastic analysis, but you act as you continue acting as you always acted, because this is what is going to happen, I guess, because profit is harder than the truth in the end. So what do you do? Actually, what have you learned in terms of finding a solution, of building an argumentation line for revealing the different truths and maybe bringing another solution than just building and taking profit out of building, because this is what is going on.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for this question. And it's beautiful because yesterday night I was at an event organized by Future Build, where I was asked to talk about the future that we can imagine and degrowth and all of that. And there was a lot of reaction in terms of thinking, yeah, okay, but how do we make this happen? It seems like it's so far away. It seems like we're so stuck. And yesterday, I think everyone who was in there really was feeling that already being there and talking about that and raising those issues was shaking quite strongly the minds of people who were sitting there promoting clean technologies and green growth. But so in the work and engagement that we have with housing associations, there is a relationship right now with housing association, but the next step with all the people who took part in the interviews. First of all, as academic, we have to, of course, produce papers and scientific papers because this is our kind of currency. But in parallel to that, we do reports. However, when I produced the report of this first part of the research to send to Housing Association, it was basically 90 pages report. And I knew that it would have just landed on the email of Housing Association thinking, it was wonderful, thanks so much, yeah, this was great, etc. Ciao. And that's why we decided to do this second workshop, in which not only I introduced the results that of the first workshop, so they could really have a first-hand understanding of what was happening, but then we could also think together about how to act upon that. And then eventually, at the end of the conversation, at the end of the workshop, Housing Association said, okay, this was great, and now the next step, we want to continue working on this idea of the building moratorium. So somehow there is this constant reinforcing dynamic that goes between what we feel like they want to go next, in order also to help themselves building an argumentation. And that's why we always send, one thing that I didn't mention is that, of course, we need to learn to listen in different ways. And one way is, of course, questionnaires. It seems a bit, but like the feedback that they give to us, one question is, would you be able to use those maps in decision making? And actually, some at the beginning were stating maybe, others were stating yes, very much. And actually, this is also a measure for us to understand after these interviews that we do together, where together we map. So it's not like I record the interview, goodbye, I go home and I do my little map, but I map together with them so that they learn what systems thinking is and how to map. Are you able to then take that map and go to, for instance, one of my interviewees said, please send it to me. I sent it to all of them. Please send it to me because I need to show this to my colleagues. So while I was interviewing them, there was this kind of, they were building the map and they were like, wow, this is the way in which my brain works. I have to show this to my colleagues. So somehow, if we do research in a way that is not extracting knowledge from others, but actually giving back while we do interviews, etc., people will feel empowered by seeing their own mental model and by being able to actually communicate in a different way. And I think that, of course, we cannot find the perfect mental model that is going to bring everything together, but already being able to express our way of understanding how the system works is already quite a very big first step to intervene in this system. Because as I said, again, yesterday night, if we all think right now, we have housing that is stable, my rent doesn't risk to increase, the quality of our homes is very good. My work week is reduced. I need to work only 4 days a week, and I can devote time to community, to the land, to grow food, to spend time with my friends and with my relatives, to care work. All of us want this. I mean, there is a whole, so we are somehow stuck within a system that we are creating, and already being able to communicate what we all want and how the system works is a first step to try then to understand how we can intervene in that. And my latest results that I didn't show yet today is that actually it seems like housing associations are quite on a path towards degrowth, despite this being very, very absurd to say. But yeah, we are on track, even if we don't perceive it. And I hope that you will all leave the room tonight thinking that we are on that path, because we are. So I hope it answers your question. Okay.
Thanks for your insight. My name is Maria. I'm an architect and urban designer here at ETH. Being not familiar with the national context of England, I would like to ask what are the social connotations of social housing within this context? And in other words, who has access? To what extent such structures are discriminatory and reproduce discriminatory structures? And in general, how social housing is perceived? For whom is it? Yeah. This is my first question. And maybe a second one is, I think there is an intersection between a bottom-up and top-down initiative and thinking. And to what extent is it bottom-up? To what extent is it top-down? And what is the valency between the actors? So who has priority, the developer or the inhabitant?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned, social housing used to be actually to represent a third of the social housing sector. When you walk around London, so many of those homes used to be social homes. They used to be as such because with Margaret Thatcher and liberal policies, they started actually to sell a lot of the social housing stock. This idea that being a homeowner will solve all the problems of our society. Actually, a lot of the housing stock went away in the hands eventually to the private rental sector, leaving only 17% of social homes. As I very shortly mentioned, this is a phenomenon that is called residualization. So eventually, only the people in the very, very, very highest needs have access to social homes because there is so little. And when you get access to that, you're on a waiting list. And eventually, when you get access to that, is actually a stable tenure. So theoretically, you can be there and be in social housing without being evicted. Even if your home is demolished, you're going to be offered another social home. Not exactly where you expected it to be, not exactly next to the neighbors that you used to live next, but that's it. And also in the maps, as it emerged, there is a lot of stigma associated to social housing, very, very strong stigma. And this is indeed related to a whole political also communication in the media of the issues around social housing, of the fact that we need to go towards home ownership and so on and so forth. So actually social housing is not regarded like housing cooperatives here, like a fantastic, yeah, wow, it costs 30% less, it's amazing, we should all live in a housing cooperative. No, it looks like, oh wow, you live in social housing. So really very, very different perception of that stigma, to the point that I think there was one of my interviewees that was saying, well, people advance in their housing career by leaving social housing. You know, you have this housing trajectory where hopefully you will leave social housing. Quickly about the top-down, bottom-up. I always think, you know, what is top and what is bottom? I always feel a little bit puzzled about this, the top-down, bottom-up approach, because somehow I see that the residents are more at the top, but I understand it depends on the power of the system, right? So if within the system that we're looking at, residents have power, then they're going to be the top-down. And no, I understand that actually. So right now, there is more and more focus on trying to work together with communities to develop social housing, to think of regeneration in a different way. However, you don't really escape from dynamics that push for the sale, demolition, and so on and so forth of housing, so that you can densify and you can make profit out of it. So for how much bottom-up you can do within that system, it is actually not working. And a lot of the actors involved would like to make it work differently, but feel like they are constrained by planning regulation, by a bunch of things that are actually giving much more power to developers to make profit. And this profit motive is indeed driving a lot of those dynamics. But there are alternative kind of housing. Community land trust, where people gather together, get a piece of land, build housing that is going to be forever affordable. There are alternative models that are being developed. But I think we can also continue this conversation in
at the apéro. So, yeah, thank you again. Okay.
I'm a bit just very short. It goes to this moratorium idea, like stop, because this is also going around right here. It's become very resonated. If you have a certain amount of housing, a certain stock, which you try to repair, then it has to be redistributed as such that it has equally distributed. And as in racism, there is privilege, and those who are privileged enough to use more space, as you also showed, and those who don't have access to it. My question is do you think that it's really this kind of privilege can be acknowledged and basically voluntarily be given?
Yeah,
or not?
Indeed. That's an excellent question. That's why we often say that it's very difficult to talk about a building moratorium or reducing working hours or shifting to cooperative if we look at that in isolation. So if now we were just to implement a building moratorium and that's it, it might have quite catastrophic consequences, actually. So that's why, again, when we look at that the concept of polycrisis, and we think, okay, we're just intervening with building more solar panels, actually displacing the problem somewhere else. It is indeed a problem that it is indeed a system. And when we look at that system, we get the wisdom of how to intervene in that system. So if we do a building moratorium, what would it take to actually have a just distribution of space? Who would be the most affected by that? However, I also want to underline that in this debate, there are people who say this will be extremely unjust from a social point of view because we need housing and we have overcrowded housing. And without taking into account, for instance, that redistribution aspect, thinking, okay, we do have a lot of empty buildings that have been built for speculative reasons in London. We do have a lot of empty buildings that are empty because they're marked for demolition. And since for different reasons they decided to demolish it, they stay there for decades, empty. So we do have a lot of empty buildings. And then the way in which these buildings will be redistributed, this needs to be part of a whole collective discussion. So it means triggering the agency of very different actors in the sector, far away from being me as a researcher or the housing associations to decide that. But it's really a profound systemic change. But I think we're all on it. So I have hope.
So thank you again, Anna, for this positive and really informing lecture.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.